This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for another History of the Banned and Restricted List video. In this series, we look at the various banned and restricted announcements throughout the game's history and discuss why those cards got banned. This series started way back in 1994 when the banned and restricted list was born, and now we're all the way up to 2020. In fact, over the last several weeks, we've covered the bans and restrictions from the first 8 months of 2020, and today we're wrapping that year up with a look at September through December. This will be the last History of the Banned and Restricted List video until next May, when we'll cover the year 2021. That way we can have some more perspective on the bans and restrictions of that year, instead of doing it right now where it was really just a year ago. Anyway, as we've seen, 2020 was a very active year with lots of bans and restrictions of new cards. That's a trend we're going to see continue in this video. Here's a couple of quick reminders about how I do things in this series. First, remember this series only looks at the banned and restricted list for Premier formats. This means I won't be talking about Brawl or Commander. Additionally, we won't be talking about cards in this video that I've covered earlier on in the series, since anytime we encounter a card getting banned for the first time, I cover that card's entire history on the banned and restricted lists of all formats. So, even though Teferi Time Raveler was banned in Historic during the time period this video covers, we won't be talking about Teferi in this video since we covered it in the last one. In all, we've got 4 cards to cover in this video, and we'll start with the September banned and restricted announcement, which only banned a single card, Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. In last week's video, we saw that Growth Spiral got banned in Standard, and Uro has a pretty similar effect. If you cast him from your hand, you get to gain 3 life, draw a card, and put a land on the battlefield. So, Uro ramps you, gains you life to offset the fact that you're not impacting the board that turn, and draws you a card. That's a pretty good deal, and exactly the kind of thing ramp decks are going to be after in virtually every Standard format. You don't get the 6/6 creature when you cast it from your hand, but that would be absurd. And anyway, Uro can escape from the graveyard later, giving you the enter the battlefield trigger again, as well as a 6/6 beater who gets the same effect every time it attacks too. So, yeah, Uro is an absolute powerhouse and was probably pushed a little bit too hard. This became especially true once Zendikar Rising came out and added Lotus Cobra and Omnath Locus of Creation to the mix. Those 3 cards together could produce absurd amounts of mana far too efficiently and far too quickly. Basically, ramp decks were crushing the format, and they decided getting rid of Uro was the best way to balance them out. Ultimately, Uro proved too powerful for a whole bunch of other formats too. In 2021, it would get banned in Historic, Pioneer, and Modern. In Historic and Pioneer, the ban came about as a result of dominating in the same kinds of Uro decks that did well in Standard before the ban. And in those formats, he could also still be played alongside Growth Spiral. In Modern, you not only had Growth Spiral, you also had Field of the Dead. And that meant that ramp strategies had an absurdly powerful payoff for just playing a bunch of lands. Uro was also one of the cards to be banned with the creation of the Explorer format earlier this year. These days, Uro is only legal in Legacy and Vintage, and those are 2 formats where it's seeing significant play. That's just how powerful Uro is. So, Uro was the only card to get the axe in the September 2020 ban and restricted announcement, but 3 more cards would get banned before the year was out. In particular, 3 cards would get the axe in Standard in October of 2020, which also marked the last announcement of the year. These cards were Omnath Locus of Creation, Lucky Clover, and Escape to the Wilds. Let's start with a look at Omnath, Locus of Creation. This is a good place to start, since we just talked about Uro, who was often played alongside this powerful elemental. Omnath might cost 4 mana of 4 different colors, but it's well worth going to the extra effort, since he provides some absolutely absurd value. First of all, he replaces himself right away, drawing you a card when he enters the battlefield, and on top of that, he has an amazing landfall ability. When you play your first land in a turn, you gain 4 life, your second land in a turn gives you 4 mana, and your third land in a turn does 4 damage to your opponent and their planeswalkers. While it might sound kind of hard to really consistently get these going with all those lands, it really wasn't, especially when Uro was around. However, the banning of Uro didn't do enough to slow down Omnath, as he was still capable of utterly taking over games. The life gain made it hard for aggro decks to ever finish you off. The extra mana it gave you allowed you to chain more spells together, including more ramp spells, which would in turn also trigger the third effect. Additionally, the mana requirement to cast Omnath wasn't even that big of a hurdle, as the format had very good mana between Tri-Lands, Pathways, and Fabled Passage. Omnath ramp decks were utterly dominant in the metagame, and this resulted in it getting banned. It also got banned in Historic in February of 2021. It's also worth noting that it got a rebalanced version for the Alchemy and Historic formats in 2022. This new version of Omnath costs 5 mana, and his Enter the Battlefield abilities scries 1 instead of drawing a card. Interestingly, they did decide that they were a little too hard on Omnath, and later in 2022, they switched his Enter the Battlefield ability back to drawing a card. Omnath still isn't seeing any play in Historic or Alchemy though. It's pretty interesting to see how much weaker a card can get just by adding a single mana. Omnath went from being a dominant card that had to be banned to being a card that doesn't really see any play. Next, let's look at Escape to the Wilds. We haven't actually seen any Eldraine cards so far in this video, but that's about to change because the last 2 cards in it, including Escape to the Wilds, are from that set. Escape to the Wilds also got banned in Standard in this same announcement, and you can see that it would be crazy good alongside Omnath since it gives you the ability to find and play multiple lands the turn you cast it. Even without Omnath, this was a card that was really powering ramp decks in Standard, and it made it a little bit too easy for players to quickly get the mana for Genesis Ultimatum or Ugin the Spirit Dragon. So even without Omnath, it was really going to warp the format around itself. As with this powerful of a card draw and ramp effect, there really wasn't a reason to do anything other than ramp. In the 2020 Grand Finals tournament, it was the second most heavily played card, indicating just how prevalent these types of decks were. Banning Escape to the Wilds made it so fewer decks were ramp decks. And the last card to be banned in the October 2020 announcement, and the last card banned in 2020 more broadly, is Lucky Clover. The Clover is a powerful payoff for the adventure mechanic, which in itself is already quite powerful. Creatures with adventure have an alternate mode where they can be used as a spell, and when their adventure side gets cast, they go to exile. Then you can play the creature from exile. This means that most of them generate 2-for-1s, especially the ones that were heavily played in Standard, so adding Lucky Clover to the mix was pretty darn absurd since it would turn those 2-for-1s into 3-for-1 since it could copy the adventure spells. Adventure decks also ran Edgewall Innkeeper, and both of these cards gave them insane value for casting their already good adventure spells. Imagine playing the Innkeeper on turn 1, the Clover on turn 2, and using, let's say, Beanstalk Giant's Adventure on turn 3. That builds a crazy advantage in a hurry. By getting rid of one of those adventure payoffs, the deck was substantially weakened, but it did still manage to exist in the format. So before these 3 cards got banned, Standard was really homogeneous. There were a whole lot of 4-color decks jamming in Omnath, Escape to the Wilds, and Lucky Clover because these things were just more powerful than anything else you could do in the format. So while these 3 cards all sort of do different things, they were all jammed into the same kind of decks too. So these bans were definitely necessary because Standard was really uninteresting. So those were the bans and restrictions from September to December of 2020. As I said at the beginning, this series won't be coming back until May of 2023, when we'll take a look back at 2021. There will still be videos on Wednesdays though, we'll just be returning to deck histories. The poll for the topic of that video for next week is up now on the community tab, so check that out. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure that you catch future editions of the History of the Banned and Restricted list and a whole lot of other content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the other 30 parts of this series, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.